very excited about this conference because it is community-based, because it is talking about communities creating change. So I want to begin with my own big thank yous to our two co-chairs from the University of Galway, but also to Mayo County Council, to Ballina 2023, to the University of Galway, and to the Mary Robinson Centre, and in particular the indomitable Susan Heffernan, and all of those who've been working behind the scenes and our sponsors to help put this conference together. It's not easy to do so, and it's multifaceted, as we've heard, and I hope people will enjoy the different aspects of it. Because I'm so excited, I'm actually going to do something. I have no notes. Well, I have. I'm going to speak from the heart. I'm going to tell you my personal story and where I am now. And that's because, unbeknownst to me in a way, I didn't realize it was going to be called the Mary Robinson Climate Conference. So I feel I have to give you a personal account. And I always acknowledge that I actually came late to the issue of climate change. You may remember, some of you who are old enough, that when I was president from 1990 to 1997, I never made any speech on climate change. I did speak about the environment, but not climate, because we were not aware, most of us. Scientists were, but most of us really weren't aware of the impact of climate. And then I went on to become the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for the next 5 years, and I really became aware of how serious the climate crisis was, but there was another part of the UN dealing with it. And honestly, I didn't make a connection with my portfolio of human rights, gender equality, the rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of people with disabilities. I just didn't make the connection. And then I had a small NGO called Realising Rights, which was working in African countries on the rights that actually matter if you don't have them, rights to food, water, health, education, etc. And I was also honorary president of Oxfam International. So I was spending a lot of time in different African countries from about 2003 on. And I suddenly realized that the climate shocks were very real in those countries. And I remember, on behalf of Oxfam, taking part in hearings before the first climate conference I went to, which was in 2009. It was the famous Copenhagen climate conference that actually didn't succeed. It was quite a failure and quite devastating. Before it, Archbishop Tutu and myself, we were both elders at the time, he was the chair of the elders, we were on a panel listening to 5 African farmers. And I wrote about this in my book of stories about climate justice. And I was very impacted by what they said, and I kind of challenged them. I said, my father was a doctor in the west of Ireland. I used to go out with him on long calls because I was the only girl and loved to be with him. And he talked about farmers, that they always complained about the weather. So I said to these African farmers, is that what you're doing? Are you just complaining about the weather? And I remember Constance O'Kellett, who's become a really good friend. We're both grandmothers, and she's from a small village in eastern Uganda, which was totally destroyed by flooding before the Copenhagen conference, earlier in 2009. And she stood up, and she's a very tall woman, and she said, I always stand when I have something important to say. And she said, this is outside our experience. And it made me think what the experience of village in Africa is. It's probably about 200 years, because you have the grandparent who talks to the grandchild, and then that grandchild becomes a grandparent and talks to the grandchildren. So saying it was outside their experience was a way of saying something is happening in our world which we cannot account for at all. And all of that was a realization I kind of, if you like, brought with me to my first conference, my first COP, in 2009 in Copenhagen. And I found it really unbelievably male and technical and scientific and nothing about people. I was really quite shocked. There was something strange about approaching this problem from the perspective of science. The only reference really to nature was polar bears on ice caps, and I have nothing against polar bears, but there was absolutely nothing about people or about gender, except for some civil society and some indigenous peoples trying to make the case. So the following year in Mexico, the next COP, a number of women got together, a number of us got together, and we formed a women leaders network on gender and climate. And that helped to get more of a gender sense and eventually a gender action plan into the whole COP procedure over a number of years. And I was, I suppose, fortunate enough, is the way I might put it, to be invited by the then Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, to have a mandate of being his special representative before the famous Paris Climate Agreement. And it was an incredibly important one because it really had to put us on the right course, if I could put it that way. And it was kind of recognized before the Paris conference began that we were likely to have a success in Paris in that President Obama and President Xi of China had met and agreed that it was important that the Paris Agreement would would move things forward. But in what way? And I was involved in the formal ministerial meetings that were taking place under the French presidency, but I was also involved in an increasing number of informal presidential ministerial meetings. And I couldn't understand what the French presidency was doing, because these were the most boring meetings you could ever go to. I mean, they were boring. You knew what Africa would say, you knew what the African countries would say, you knew what the United States would say, you knew what India would say, you knew what all the countries would say. They repeated their lines. But there was one voice in that informal ministerial that got into the ear of the others, and that was the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands are very small atolls in the Pacific, very low level, and Tony de Bruyn knew that if we did not commit to staying at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, his atolls were gone. They would be covered by sea level rise. So he kept saying, in a very particular way and very persuasive way, I mean, do you want us to no longer be a sovereign people? Do you want us to just go under? I mean, we have made arrangements. We can move to Fiji and we'll just be a group of people, but we won't be a nation. Is that what you want? And it somehow got into the ear. And meanwhile, before and especially at Paris, you had huge marches going on. Indigenous peoples, young people. And we marched in the street in Paris, 1.5 to stay alive. Does anybody in the audience take part in those marches just as a matter of interest? 1.5 to stay alive. I'll never forget it. It was really very impactful. And a high ambition coalition was formed after the Paris conference began, with one objective, one goal, which was to get 1.5 referenced in the new goal from Paris. And the leader of the High Ambition Coalition was Tony de Bruyn. Eventually the European Union joined, then the United States joined, then various countries joined. And we got this new goal. And the goal was to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius and basically work for 1.5. That's the meaning of the technical language. And these scientists, and we'll hear from a very distinguished scientist after me, a member of the IPCC, had not, as I understand, studied the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees formally in their reporting. And they were asked to do that, and they came out with their special report in October 2018, a special report on 1.5 degrees warming. And their message was very clear, and actually they've repeated it over and over and over again in all their recent reports. And it said, actually, the whole world needs to stay at 1.5. That is the limit of a safe, livable world. After that, there may be tipping points, like maybe the coral reefs might disappear, the Arctic ice might disappear, the permafrost might melt and throw up not just carbon, but methane, which is more dangerous in the short term. So the whole world really should stay at 1.5 degrees. And that changed over a bit of time to commitments of governments, commitments of corporations, commitments of everybody to be net zero by 2050 and to be working to 2030. What the IPCC said was, in order to stay on course for a livable world, we needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. They said you have 12 years. This was in October 2018. We now have 7 years, and we're not on course for that. That's the dilemma that we have, and we have that dilemma in conferences. I was in the Glasgow conference, COP26, and I was in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, for the elders, as chair of the elders, that Nelson Mandela brought together in 2007. And in both cases, I saw the report of a group that calculate the pledges and the promises made by everyone. It's called Carbon Action Tracker. And Carbon Action Tracker was able to conclude, sadly, that if you added up all the pledges and commitments that governments made, that corporations made, and that investment made in 2008, and it was the same in 2009, and what was the result of that? We were on course for a 2.4 degrees world of warming, at best, if all of those pledges were fulfilled, which they're not being. And I'll come to that as well. They're not being because a lot of what corporations do is what we call greenwashing, promises but not the steps to fulfill them. Governments, I think democratic governments are in a difficult position because they're finding it hard. We know here in Ireland, we have good climate legislation. We're part of the EU, which is committed to a 50%, that's going up to 55% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. But we're not on course. I mean, you saw quite recently an assessment. I think we have some distinguished scientists also from Maynooth University, and they'll probably confirm this. We're going to achieve about 29% reduction, not 50% or maybe 55%. In other words, despite the efforts, we're not there. And the reason we're not there, I think, is because we're not actually in crisis mode. Do you remember what Greta Thunberg said quite a long time ago? And I was with her recently in Kyiv. We were looking at the situation in Ukraine, the environmental damage, the responsibility for that damage, and how to build back green. And when she started as a young girl of 15 and 16 and began to speak out, she said, "Our house is burning." It's a very good way of putting it. Our house is actually burning. Our planet is not in a sustainable shape at the moment because of what we're doing, and it's getting worse. And we should be in crisis mode. And we're actually not in crisis mode. And so how do we turn that tide? I was very affected by the movement before Paris of the indigenous peoples, young people, civil society marching in the street for 1.5, and Tony de Broom in the room making his case. I think we need, and the pieces of it are there actually to some extent, we need a very broad climate movement. Maybe I'll come back to that and end on that. I just want to come back locally here to Ballina. I was delighted to take part in February in a workshop with young leaders, sort of fifth-year students from 6 schools here in Mayo. Well, actually, one was from Enniscrone, but we count. Enniscrone was almost Mayo. And it was very interesting to hear them. And yesterday, we had with the ambassadors of the United States and France and the president of Galway, who had been, University of Galway, who had been at the workshop as well. And we had one of these schools, St. Louis in Kiltimagh, show what they had done to follow up on the project that they had committed to. All the schools committed to projects. And it was very good to see an amenity park that they had developed and they were going to build on over the years as the school for the community. We have a lot of projects of communities that are going to be exhibited, a lot of different ways in which, not just in Ballina and Mayo, but we have representatives of counties from all over the country. You're there in the audience. And this is so important because it's not just a case of the climate crisis, the climate and nature crisis being an all-of-government crisis. It's an all-of-community crisis. It's an all-of-people crisis. So we have to bring it to the local level. And we've got to work in a very, very determined, crisis-led way to make sure that we are as environmentally nurturing of nature as possible, and that we are really working on the carbon footprints, etc. But that's at the local level, which is going to be really important in this conference. And I think we haven't enough of it yet. We need this all over the country and all over every country, that from bottom up, people are realizing how important it is to take every step possible, because that puts pressure then on the more political level. At the political level, we have a communications crisis. The climate crisis is essentially a communications crisis. We know that there are climate shocks. We know what happened in Pakistan, huge flooding over a third of the country, and people are still suffering enormously. We know there are fires in California, fires in Canada now. People are dying of heat in different parts of the world. Yesterday was the hottest day in Ireland and the UK. The second mandate that I got about climate was in 2016. It was a mandate as the special representative of the Secretary-General on El Niño and climate. That was the title of the mandate. And I travelled to Honduras to see the impact on the dry corridor of Central America. And I'll never forget sitting with women under a tree. And one of the women with pain in her eyes said to me, "We have no water. How do you live without water?" And I went to Southern Africa to meet with the SADC countries who are all suffering very heavily. I also went to Tigray in Ethiopia with great support from the Irish government and Irish aid agencies who've done a lot of work in Tigray. And I saw very arid countryside and then some good water management, but even that was under stress because of the effects of El Niño. 2016 is still the hottest year we've ever had, 2016. But now we have another El Niño that has just begun. So 2023 is likely to be the hottest year. I'll be corrected by the scientists if I'm not right about that. And maybe 2024, if the El Niño becomes very strong next year, will be the worst ever. So a lot of people will die from heat. A lot of people will become very ill from heat if they have to work outdoors in climate situation that is not tolerable. Why are we not taking this more seriously? Why are we not moving more seriously? Because there is a big communications budget about climate. Billions are being spent, but they're being spent for the wrong reasons. They're being spent by the coal, oil and gas lobby. The fossil fuel lobby spends billions telling us that we need to continue with fossil fuel, telling us, yes, of course they're net zero by 2050, don't worry, we're going to be net zero, but we have to continue with it, and kind of messing the science and blurring the edges and confusing. Billions spent. There's almost nothing spent on persuading us that we're in a crisis that needs to be dealt with as a crisis. So I'm coming now to my tipping point. I'm going to answer the question because I won't be on the panel. My tipping point with a number of other women leaders, and we started this last year, but we've been building on it, is what we call Project Dandelion. It's a feminist earthshot. We didn't like the moonshot. Well, it's not that we didn't like the technical way that the moonshot of John F. Kennedy had played out. It was technical, it was military, it was competitive with Russia, etc. No, we wanted something completely different. So Project Dandelion recognises that, as I've learned, the dandelion is the only flower-stroke weed. Most of us consider it a weed, but I'm beginning to change and think of it as a flower now. It's the only one that grows on all 7 continents. It's very resilient. I mean, you can't get rid of the damn thing off your lawn if you want to. It's very regenerative. It's got these deep roots, and some wise farmers are realising now it's very good for the soil. And in the rewilding, we're seeing it's actually part of looking again at wildflowers, including the dandelion, and then how do you spread it? So we have begun to get women leaders who didn't prioritise climate. And that's most women leaders, frankly. They prioritise violence against women, women's health, girls' education, Me Too issues, discrimination issues, but not climate. It's not usually what women leaders do, either locally or internationally. We have to change that, because the pieces of a possible movement are there. Young people are already there. Fridays for Future, the young protesters, Extinction Rebellion, all those protesters. Indigenous communities have been there from the beginning and can tell us with great wisdom how we can address a lot of the issues. There are good business leaders who are stepping up. I belong to a group of the B team of business leaders, and they're heads of very big, very large companies, and they talk the same language as me. They talk the need for crisis approach, and we have to tackle the fossil fuel lobby and the big emitters and try and address that. So the kind of components of a movement are potentially there, but it needs leadership and management. And, you know, if the house is on fire, who steps up? Isn't it the woman? Come on, isn't it the woman who'll make it happen? You know, so that's my tipping point, that we need, in Project Dandelion, to have a light touch framing that we connect all the doing that's going on, including all the community doing, which will come out of this conference here in Ballina, and we put pressure of the right sort on democratic governments. They need to hear this pressure to take harder decisions more quickly. They don't feel it at the moment. They feel the lobbies, and I'm aware that there are various lobbies against some of the things that we should be doing. But we actually need to think in utter crisis urgency terms. And I want to end with a sentence from Nelson Mandela, since he founded the Elders and brought us together, and I now have the honour to be the third chair. He said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." And we need to do it because we need to succeed. Thank you very much.